It's now been exactly 18 months since the original ASUS ROG Ally with the Z1 Extreme has been released. And because quite a few new and important games have been published since then, I wanted to give it a revisit now that it also had several BIOS and driver updates and could be considered finished, completed, polished, whatever. So let's have a closer look.
This is Hubwood.
For me, the most interesting aspect about this is one of its, in my opinion, biggest flaws. Yes, I'm talking about the RAM size of only 16 GB, which has to be shared as VRAM. And as new games tend to need more and more RAM and VRAM every year, we're gonna put it to the test with a bunch of new AAA titles, AA titles, and indie games. For this video, I was actually recording the gameplay via my camera to make it a bit more authentic. And yes, I was using the Ally plugged in at its 30-watt turbo mode, whereas on battery with 25 watt it would only be slightly slower and most of today's tested games will still run okay. I was also trying to use AFMF in all games, but it turned out that in most cases that didn't work. It's usually an issue with the Microsoft Game Pass games, which for whatever reason aren't recognized as games by the AMD driver options, and workarounds didn't help. And yeah, you probably can optimize the ROG Ally even better than I did. As for each of these games, there are several dedicated videos on YouTube with different settings and tips like which pre-allocated VRAM size to use, which resolution and FSR mode, etc. But that would just push the boundaries and the purpose of this video, because I just wanted to get a general idea of how the ROG Ally is performing 1.5 years later. For this video I was setting the VRAM to auto for most games, since for example titles like Alan Wake 2 didn't start if I set a manual VRAM size for whatever reason. But again, in some cases, manually setting this to 5 or 8 GB could further improve the performance. But now, without further ado, let's just jump to the benchmarks. And I know I didn't test all the important games that have been released lately, but I simply just don't own all of them yet. And feel free to donate game keys anytime. For Alan Wake 2, I was using more or less the lowest settings except for some SSAO, so ambient occlusion, and reflections at 1080p with FSR set to performance, which means it's rendering the game at 960 by 540 before upscaling it. And at first the FPS seemed to be in the 30s with quite wild frame times and probably pretty bad 1% lows. But I was able to activate AFMF over the AMD drivers in this case. But for that to work, I needed to use the AMD overlay instead of Afterburner. And that resulted in around 60 to 90 FPS with some drops to the 30s and 40s when moving the camera, just as if AFMF isn't catching up in that case. But I was able to play through the first chapter that way without bothering about stuttering or the looks too much, as it actually looks quite nice on the small 7-inch screen despite the settings and the resolution. For Ubisoft's Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, I was setting the graphics to the lowest possible options at 720p in combination with frame generation and FSR set to ultra performance. And while that somehow still looks quite amazing and I actually got FPS in the 40s and 50s, the game was absolutely unplayable due to heavy stuttering and reoccurring freezes. And I'm pretty sure that the FSR didn't actually work, because in that case, I mean 720p plus FSR set to performance, it would actually render at 360 by 180 or so. I think it just ignores that. But I really tried a lot of different options for the settings, the VRAM size, etc. and watched a few videos on how to set up the Ally for that game, but it seems others suffer from the same issue and we'd really have to label this game as more or less unplayable. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 ran surprisingly well. Once again, I was using the lowest settings at 720p and FSR set to balanced but without frame generation activated, and for the single player campaign that resulted in between 80 and up to 120 FPS and seemed to still look okay on the Ally's 7-inch screen. The frame time graph looked super smooth for the single player campaign, and a side note, I suck at playing FPS games with thumbsticks, so please forgive me and my bad gameplay, thanks. With those same settings, I was also testing the multiplayer part via the Nuketown map and saw between 70 and 90 FPS in that case, with very minor and ignorable microstutters once in a while, but overall just perfectly playable while looking good enough in my opinion. For the Valheim-like survival game Enshrouded, I was once again using 720p and FSR on quality, while otherwise I used the lowest settings except for SSAO, small foliage, distant objects and tessellation set to the second lowest option. That resulted in between 35 and 50 FPS and felt really super smooth and fast overall thanks to the Ally's adaptive sync display, while I actually played the game for a few hours on the Ally that way. Definitely playable quite well, though it doesn't look that good with these settings, but some videos suggest that AFMF should work, but as the game seems to run with the Wukong API, I don't see how that's possible, and I've spent a lot of time trying to get AFMF to work, but I failed. For FIFA 2025, I was using 720p once more, but medium settings this time. Since the MSI Afterburner OSD does not work in this title, I was using the Ally's internal OSD. For the gameplay, I saw between 60 and 80 FPS most of the time, a few microstutters here and there, but certainly playable pretty well. But actually capping the FPS at 60 could be a good option here to probably improve stability and lower the light stuttering. But again, nothing severe, it's definitely playable, no need for frame generation either, so let's just jump right to the next game. For Helldivers 2, I actually managed to use AFMF, also known as the driver-based frame generation alternative, and at 1080p with balanced resolution scaling and the graphics preset set to Steam Deck, I saw around 35 to 80 FPS. The weird thing with AFMF is that for me, every time I turned the camera a bit faster, it seemed to deactivate and show the non-frame generated FPS for a second just to recover once I stopped moving the camera too quickly. Well, anyhow, the game was very playable that way, though there have been some minor stutters here and there once in a while. But nothing too serious. I wasn't able to use my regular frame time graph in this case, since AFMF wouldn't work with the MSI Afterburner OSD being active. A few weeks ago I was testing Senuas Saga Hellblade 2 on the new ASUS ZenBook S14, which in that case wasn't really playable on the new Intel Lunar Lake 200V CPUs, but the 780M in the ROG Ally Z1 Extreme managed to push out between 30 and 45 FPS most of the time at 720p. I mean, well, 720p with black bars, low settings and FSR 3 set to performance. As I only have the game via the Game Pass, frame generation did not work for me here, unfortunately, but still it is playable. The game's graphics are fantastic even on this level, but due to the 720p and the upscaling in combination, it does look quite a bit blurry, but it still looks like a movie a lot of times. Hey, this is a bit odd, but hear me out for a second. So today's video does not have an official sponsor. Well, I guess you could say I'm sponsoring it myself, presenting you a product that I really love myself. Because let me just briefly talk about the best toothbrush I've ever used in my life, only for a minute. It's the LAIFEN Wave by a company called LAIFEN, and I've had zero contact with them. I bought the brush entirely on my own with my own money. And I know I usually do laptop stuff, and as said before, I know this is a bit weird, but I wanted to let you know that since I've started using it a few months ago, my whole toothbrushing game has completely changed, a lot, because it feels like I received a professional teeth cleaning by a dentist afterwards every single time, without the pain. And it apparently uses a mix of oscillation and sonic hyperspeed movements, and my teeth just feel so clean and smooth afterwards. The battery life is insane, it lasts for about 3 to 4 weeks. I also gave it to my partner to test it, and she also started using one immediately. It has 3 performance modes that you can configure, and there's an app you could use, while I didn't even need that yet. It just worked out of the box. And it starts at only around $48 or 59 euros right now in this white version. Free shipping, 30 days refund policy and a 2-year warranty. I'll post an affiliate link in the description if you're interested, and I don't think that you'd regret it. Anyway, that's it from me about toothbrushes. Let's jump back into today's video. I actually postponed this video for a few days because of the 2 next games. The first being Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which as a matter of fact won't work on a GTX 1080 Ti, but it runs on a Radeon 780M integrated graphics since it demands hardware ray tracing capabilities. That's kinda crazy. However, I was using the lowest possible settings at 720p with additional resolution scaling to 50%. That causes some blurry edges, but at least I saw at least 30 FPS most of the time and even much more inside buildings. I mean, the game basically came out the day I was recording this footage, so there might be some optimization, driver and patch-wise, but it seems as if it is just playable alright even right now, while it still looks decent enough on the small 7-inch screen, even at this low resolution. Be aware, I had a few crashes due to the lack of memory when I was trying to use medium settings, so don't do that, at least on the non-ASUS Ally. PS, this being a Wukong game via the Game Pass without full screen mode, so forget about AFMF. And I also tested the brand new Overwatch 3, I mean Marvel Rivals at 720p with low settings, FSR set to performance, and I actually activated frame generation just because I wanted to see some high FPS here. And well, what can I say, I saw around 100 to 140 FPS. Playable, absolutely, but I saw a few micro stutters / freezes from time to time, not too many, and maybe they would go away after playing a little longer or with future updates, but I guess we can expect this free-to-play title to be playable just fine on this little gaming handheld. For the early access version of Manor Lords, I was using a mouse for better navigation. At 1080p with FSR set to balanced and medium settings, this medieval building strategy game still looks pretty neat and plays alright with around 25 to 50 FPS, depending on the current camera angle and zoom level and what we actually see on the screen. But if you're into games like that, it's definitely worth a look, even on the gaming handheld device, if you're okay with using thumbsticks for navigation. Definitely playable. And even the brand new Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 was playable alright at 720p with low settings and FSR set to balanced. I saw between 30 and 40 FPS and mostly stable frame times with a few micro stutters here and there while looking okay. But for this game most people are probably okay with 30 FPS plus anyhow. Sure, it's not super sharp due to the combination of 720p and FSR, but to repeat myself, still okay on a 7-inch screen. By the way, again, AFMF did not work and I was setting the VRAM to auto for this game, which seems to work just fine with a total of around 14.5 GB of RAM/VRAM used. I also tested Ubisoft's Star Wars Outlaws at 720p with FSR set to quality and frame generation activated with the low settings, while also trying different RAM configurations. For a small external mission that seemed to be pretty playable even with this weird looking frame time graph at around 60 to 75 FPS, and I didn't feel a lot of stuttering here, though once I went back to the main planet and walked around in the open world, the experience was significantly worse. I now only saw around 25 to 45 FPS with severe stuttering issues and some longer freezes every now and then. So I would actually have to say it's unplayable for me that way. I honestly don't know if there are ways to improve that and get the game to run more stable, though deactivating frame generation most certainly isn't a good idea to begin with. For Palworld, which was released in early 2024, I was using 720p with FXAA and medium settings, resulting in around 45 to 70 FPS most of the time, with a few stutters here and there, but it was playable very well overall. The VRAM was again set to auto, and once more AFMF didn't work since I'm using the Microsoft Game Pass version, would probably work with the Steam version though, but a few stutters again occurred here and there. I also tested a new indie game called the Plucky Squire, which is a great mix of simple Zelda-like 2D comic gameplay and actually really nice looking 3D, and it worked perfectly fine even at the highest settings with 75 to 130 FPS, while the game does have a fantastic childbook-like art style in 2D, and the 3D parts kinda look like they're from It Takes Two or something like that, while I wondered how that 3D part runs so well even on these high settings, but that was absolutely no problem for the ROG Ally. And last but not least, I ran the Wukong Black Myth benchmark at 720p. First at 100% resolution scaling and low settings, combined with the game's integrated frame generation. And that runs very well with around 67 FPS on average and very stable frame times. For this, I was setting the VRAM size to 4GB. Seemed to work pretty well. But I also tried 720p with medium settings and even turned off frame generation, while I lowered the resolution scaling to 75%. While that was performing significantly slower with now only 38 FPS, it still seems to be playable overall, even with medium settings. Now, as expected, we can see that in some games the original ASUS ROG Ally is struggling due to the RAM/VRAM limitation, though I was surprised that titles like Hellblade 2, Call of Duty Black Ops 6, Alan Wake 2 or the new Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 are quite playable despite that, some more than others. And I'm pretty sure that the ROG Ally X with its 24GB of RAM will last a lot longer considering that bottleneck, and ASUS should already have used 24GB of RAM here. However, all of the tested games at least started and worked without crashes. And again, tinkering around a little more for some of today's tested titles could probably improve the performance even further. I mean, of course, it really depends what you expect. It's not a high-end gaming machine, of course, but it's still able to play a lot of games in an enjoyable way. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more gaming handheld, mobile GPU and iGPU benchmarks, as well as laptop reviews in general. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.